Good morning. I am Tracy. I'm a reference librarian here at Mentor Public Library. And today I am going to talk to you about Queen Elizabeth, also known as the Queen Mother. And she was Queen Consort from 1936 through 1952. She lived for 101 years, and she became a staple of the royal family. Everyone wanted to see her, everybody knew her, and she was always popular. And interestingly enough, she never wanted to be a part of this family. She never wanted to be a royal, but she was a tremendous success at it. And she was born in 1900, the beginning of the 20th century. There were new hopes and beginnings for the United Kingdom. And it was August 4th, 1900, that she was born. Queen Victoria was still on the throne, and we don't know much about her birth or even where she was born, actually. The family failed to register her birth until far after the fact. We know that she was christened in Hertfordshire, but we don't know exactly where she was born, and there's a couple of theories about it, but nothing is confirmed. But it is most likely that she was born in London or Hertfordshire. She spent her child at St. Paul's, Waldenbury, in Glamis, and in London. She was educated by a governess, and she did go to public school for a short time. She loved ponies and dogs. She had a love for animals. Her father was Claude Bowes-Lyon. He was Lord Glamis when she was born, and he loved gardening. He was a very down-to-earth man. When they were giving tours of Glamis or people were coming to the castle, he engaged with them. And he also worked on the gardens in the house by himself. So a couple of times, he was actually mistaken for a maintenance man or a laborer on the estate. Her mother was Cecilia Cavendish Betnick, and she loved hosting events. She played the piano, and she was a very accomplished player. She was religious, and she wanted a peaceful, quiet family life. They had 10 children. Elizabeth was the 9th of 10. Unfortunately, she never met her oldest sister, Violet. Violet died of diphtheria before Elizabeth was born. There was Mary, Patrick, who inherited the family title, John, and Alexander, who died when Elizabeth was 11. He was in his 20s, and he died of a brain tumor. There was Fergus, Rose, Michael, and David. She was definitely closest to David. He was the 10th child of their parents. They played pranks together. They got into mischief. Their mother called them their own little set. She grew up in St. Paul's, Waldenbury, in Hertfordshire. She also lived at Glamis in Scotland and Belgrave Mansions in London, and those were her primary childhood homes. She was educated by a Jewish governess. Kathy Kubler was a private tutor that helped Elizabeth learn German. She also helped Elizabeth pass the Oxford local exam, aged 13. Kathy went home to visit family in Germany when World War I broke out, and she never returned. She became a nurse and then later wanted to go back to teaching, and the Strathmores provided her a reference to return to teaching. And they sent the reference all the way to Germany. In 1914, World War I broke out. Soldiers came to Glamis because it was turned into a hospital for the wounded. And Elizabeth talked with the men and made sure they were comfortable and taken care of. Her brothers went off to war. Tragically, Fergus was killed in the Battle of Loos in 1915. A couple of his fellow soldiers were at his side when he died. Their parents were devastated. And in a sign of respect, the soldiers stopped playing music and games at Glamis. But Her parents encouraged the soldiers to play on. They wanted them to enjoy their time at Glamis as much as they could. Her brother Michael was in prison during the war. He became a prisoner of war in about 1915, and he was released at the very end of the war in either 1917 or 18. World War I made Elizabeth grow up. There was also a castle fire in September of 1916. Elizabeth was integral in helping save family heirlooms and contents. She was confirmed in the Church of Forfar in late 1916 at St. John's Episcopal Church. She became a debutante, and she attended parties. She actually had many suitors, one being James Stuart, the equerry of Albert, who was a prince and also Duke of York at the time. It turns out, awkwardly, that the Duke was also interested. He met her at a ball in the early 1920s, but she didn't really want to marry into the royal family. It didn't really bother her that the Duke was a bit hesitant, awkward, had a bit of a stutter. She wrote in letters that he was very nice. But she didn't want to be a royal in the first place. He proposed for the first time in 1921, and she rejected him. She said she was afraid never again to be free to think, speak, and act as I really ought to. Queen Mary was determined to meet the woman that had taken her son, the Duke of York's heart. And when she met her, she believed she was the one girl who could make Bertie happy. In 1922, the Duke of York's sister, Princess Mary, marries the Viscount Lascelles. Elizabeth is a bridesmaid. He proposed about a month after the wedding. Elizabeth's parents were unhelpful at getting her to marry the Duke because they were also hesitant about royal life. He proposed eventually for a third time. On January 13th, 1923, Elizabeth accepted. She was the daughter of the peer, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Clinghorn. She was considered a commoner, so this engagement was very unique for the royal family at the time, and it showed that you no longer had to marry someone from nobility. They went to see the king and queen a few days later. Elizabeth's ring had cashmere sapphire and 2 diamonds. Elizabeth wrote to her brother, "I felt a door close behind me that will never open again," as she was referring to a normal life, that she would no longer be able to have the freedoms that she once had. So the Duke of York and Elizabeth were married on April 26, 1923. It was at Westminster Abbey, and people were very excited about the wedding. While she was going down the aisle, she put a bouquet on the tomb of the unknown warrior. And the unknown warrior was buried in Westminster Abbey. It was someone, a British soldier, that was wounded so unrecognizably that they didn't know who it was. And Elizabeth placed a bouquet, which touched people. She may have thought of her brother Fergus when doing that act. After the wedding, she became Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of York. She had rings of 22-carat Welsh gold. There were 8 bridesmaids. This wedding was not broadcast to the public. The dress was ivory chiffon moire with pearls and silver thread. It had Flanders lace train given by the Queen Mary. And Madame Henley Seymour designed the dress. There was Brussels lace inserted in the dress, which was a Strathmore heirloom. There was a silver leaf girdle that had a train of spring green tulle with silver and rose thistle. There was orange blossom wreaths with the white rose of York. The dress was actually revealed before the wedding. Everybody knew what she was going to wear. But it was worked on until actually the day before the wedding. The groom wore his Royal Air Force uniform. There was a wedding breakfast at Buckingham Palace following the ceremony. They had their honeymoon at Polden Lacey in Surrey in Scotland. Unfortunately, Elizabeth came down with whooping cough during her honeymoon, which she said in letters was so unromantic. She became the HRH, Duchess of York, and now it was her time to take on royal duties. She immediately was loved by the public. Her first tours were to Northern Ireland in July of 1924. And in 1924 to 25, there was an election. The Conservatives beat the Labour Party. And she wrote to her mother that that was just marvelous. And there was a tour to East Africa. They were supposed to go to Egypt, but the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan ambassador, Sir Henry Lee Stacks, was assassinated. So they went to Aden, Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan, but the Egypt portion was canceled. So the Duke of York, her husband, had a stammer, and this started in childhood. And it wasn't helped by being intimidated by his father, who would always say, "Oh, get it out," when he stuttered. He was also extremely shy and had some health issues. And on October 1925, it was his responsibility to close the British Empire exhibit at Wembley Stadium in front of 100,000 people, including his father and his wife. He stammered through the whole speech, and it was humiliating for all involved. And it was that moment that they knew they couldn't do this without therapy. Therapy was necessary. But there was actually a man in the crowd that could possibly help. His name was Lionel Logue, and he was an Australian self-taught therapist. He said it was too late to completely get rid of the stammer, but he could very nearly do it. He asked the Duke to come to his office rather than him going to the palace, just to show that he was very serious about his lessons. So the Duke and Duchess decided to give this one last try. They had tried therapists before, and nothing had really helped. But Lionel Logue did, especially with breathing techniques that he taught the Duke, and they eventually became friends. And the friendship lasted until the Duke became king, and then eventually it lasted until his death. The most exciting thing about their lives in 1926 was Princess Lilibet, or Princess Elizabeth. Lilibet was the nickname because she couldn't pronounce her name, and she pronounced it Lilibet, and it caught on. She was born April 21st, 1926, and her parents were overjoyed. Elizabeth was born by cesarean section after a hard labor at 17 Bruton Street, which was, at the time, Elizabeth's parents' house in London. And both these sets of grandparents loved this child and were so overjoyed to have a grandchild. Even before Princess Elizabeth's first birthday, the Duke and Duchess were called upon to go on a tour of Australia and New Zealand. And the Duchess remarked, "Oh, I'm so miserable leaving the baby." And she had a hard time not weeping as she left the house. Princess Elizabeth was left in care of both grandparents as they took turns while this tour was going on. It was for several months. They first went to Jamaica and then to the Panama Canal. And when they got to Fiji, there were a line of people. And as the Duchess was shaking all the hands At the end of the line, there was a dog, and she shook its paw. She became ill with a cold, and she couldn't do all the tour duties. The Duke was a bit worried. Oh, they probably love her, and they don't care about me. What am I going to do now? But they still enjoyed meeting him. She became ill when she had the cold. She fished on Bay Islands. They also went to the Suez Canal, Malta, and Gibraltar. During the trip, the HMS Rione, their ship, caught fire, and they almost had to evacuate before they got it under control. August 21st, 1930, Princess Margaret was born. They originally wanted to name her Anne. George V, the king at the time, rejected this. He did not like the name Anne. So they ended up naming her Margaret Rose. And she was born at her mother's home, Glamis Castle, on August 21st, 1930. And around this time, the family moved from White Lodge at Richmond Park, which the Duchess never really cared for, to 145 Piccadilly. And just in general, as a nickname called just 145. This became their family home for around 15 years. They had a happy and quiet life, just as what a future king called we four. They were minor royals, and people loved seeing a family, a young family within the royals. They had nannies, but they also enjoyed time with their children. Later on, Wallis Warfield Simpson came into the picture, which the royal family also called that woman. She was American-born. She was raised in Baltimore, and she replaced the Prince of Wales, Edward's mistress, Freda Dudley Ward, and her successor, Thelma Furness. The family did not like her. She was domineering, she painted her nails, and she did what she wanted. She was also divorced, and not yet divorced from her second husband. She could be abrasive. She had a nickname for Elizabeth as well. She called her Cookie because she reminded her of a fat Scottish cook. The king had often been ill in the late 1920s, and the Prince of Wales, Edward, took over most of the official duties during that time. But in January of 36, the king took his last breath and died surrounded by his family. His beloved sister, Victoria, died a month before. He had been on the throne for 25 years. There was a state funeral, and he was buried at St. George's Chapel. When he was lying in state at Westminster Hall, 300,000 people passed by his coffin. He had a difficult relationship with his children, but he had a positive one with Elizabeth. And it shocked the family when she was late to a dinner event, when he was always on time. He had a very strict schedule, just like he had when he originally was in the military. She apologized for being late to dinner, and he said, "Oh no, my dear, we sat down a couple minutes too early." Now, Edward becomes king, and he is to be Edward VIII. His relationship with Mrs. Simpson was a constitutional crisis. She was going to be twice divorced, and he would be head of the Church of England. The Church of England does not look highly upon divorce, and he would be the head of a church that technically wouldn't allow his marriage or acknowledge it. What to do was heavily debated in Parliament, and about whether they even could be married and have him retain the crown. After debates, the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, told him it was probably the best that he advocate. So Edward actually reigned only until December of 36. It meets his father's prediction. He predicted that the boy would ruin himself within 12 months. And he gave an abdication speech and signed the abdication document with all his brothers. This meant, as they were the next in line, having the crown, the Duke and Duchess of York are now king and queen. So Elizabeth becomes queen and is determined to do well. She's queen consort and now Empress of India. Her husband gave her the First Lady of the Thistle at the coronation in a tribute to her Scottish heritage. She is determined to help her husband, but she is furious at Edward and Wallis, who are now the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. This changed things for her family forever. Her daughter Elizabeth was only 10 years old and now had to face life changes and the fact that one day she would also be queen. Awkwardly, as an informal family originally, her daughters now had to curtsy to their parents. King George VI, who took the name George, even though his birth name was Albert, to honor his father, and Elizabeth, now queen consort, were coronated on May 12, 1937, just a couple months after taking the throne. And this was because it had already been scheduled for Edward's coronation. They did not change the date. It was the same. It all stayed the same. So it followed the 1911 coronation closely, so of the new king's parents. They did the anointing, and the king was anointed with the crown, and he had an enthronement. This was a much shorter ceremony for Elizabeth. She wore the Koh-i-Noor diamond tiara, which is now controversial. I think they even took the Koh-i-Noor gem out of the most recent coronation tiara. She got 2 holes, an orb and scepter, an ivory rod with a dove. There was a return procession over 6 miles. There were 32,000 soldiers and sailors that participated and 20,000 police. To commemorate the event, they had medals, coinage, and military parades throughout the empire. And dignitaries from all across the empire, including India and Africa, came to the event. There were lots of prime ministers. And in procession, they left in a gold carriage. It was the first major outside broadcast, but they didn't film the interior. What was filmed and on radio was shown to the public, and it was the first to be filmed at all. There were many traditional elements included, and Queen Mary helped with the furniture design. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, presided over the ceremony. There was a new crown made, and it was fully of platinum. Elizabeth wore silk satin, pure gold thread, embroidered in rose and thistle patterns. She had an ermine velvet robe, floral and gold outline, created by the same person that did her wedding dress, Elizabeth Handley Seymour. And there were emblems of the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, the national flowers of South Africa, and the Indian lotus flower for India were also incorporated. And Norman Hartnell, a famous designer, did the Maids of Honor's dresses. They all left in a gold carriage and waved as they went to Buckingham Palace. And around that time, the next month, on the late king's birthday, Edward and Wallis, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, get married. Their first state visit as king and queen was to France in 1938. And if you look through pictures of this event, Elizabeth is wearing white. And that is because she is mourning the loss of her mother. And it actually slightly was delayed, so she could go to the funeral of her mother. Norman Hartnell designed her gowns, and he created them in 3 weeks, and they are absolutely exquisite. This was to bolster Anglo-French relations. They traveled by boat and then train. They met President Lebrun, and they had a procession through Paris. There was a state banquet and a boat ride on the Seine and a reception at the hotel. There was also a garden party and a gala performance and opera. They went to a military exhibit and had lunch at Versailles. There was another banquet held by the French Foreign Office. And on their final day, they went to the memorial to the Australian Imperial Forces. They were unveiling the exhibit, and they both laid flowers. Elizabeth was given a poppy by a child, and she laid it on top of the king's flower. And when Hitler saw this event and heard about it, he called Elizabeth the most dangerous woman in Europe. On the North American tour in 1939, it was the first tour that had gone to America in quite some time. And they were the first king and queen to go to the United States and Canada by the current reigning monarchs. This was when war was almost imminent, and they wanted to bolster relations and get sympathy. The trip was from May 17th to June 15th. They went to every province in Canada, including Newfoundland. They had huge crowds, and they arrived up the St. Lawrence River, traveling by boat, and they were received by Prime Minister Mackenzie King. They then came to DC to visit Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. They had huge crowds. They went to New York City and also Poughkeepsie. Mackenzie King was still on the tour because there was no prime minister from Britain present with them. So he felt a little odd, and they said, "No, it feels perfect, come with us." They saw Mount Vernon and the New York World's Fair. They had dinner at the president's home, Hyde Park Estate, and Roosevelt served hot dogs, smoked turkey, and strawberry shortcake. It was the first time the king and queen had had hot dogs. Elizabeth had actually asked, "How do I eat them?" And First Lady Eleanor said, "With your hands." Elizabeth clearly didn't really feel comfortable doing that because she ate hers with a fork and knife. But the two couples got along fantastically. After the visit, they went back to Canada. And they visited New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, as well as Nova Scotia. And the king and queen each delivered a speech of thanks. Later, Elizabeth would write to Prime Minister Mackenzie King saying, "That tour made us. It was a huge success." War broke out in September of 1939, and the king and queen hoped that the Munich Agreement would help neutralize Germany. Unfortunately, it did not. So the queen, to raise money for the Red Cross, created a book as a charity featuring 50 artists and authors that contributed. She auctioned it off and sold it in aid of the Red Cross. And Queen Elizabeth took a much deeper approach than Queen Mary. Queen Mary had helped. She did volunteer work in knitting in World War I, but Queen Elizabeth gave speeches to the nation to comfort mothers and families when there were evacuating children. And in addition, she could relate to the pain of having evacuated children because her own children were evacuated. And it said the princesses were sent to a secret location, meaning Windsor Castle. It was once debated whether the family leave London or the country while it was being bombed. Elizabeth had a saying about it. The children won't leave without me. I won't leave without the king, and the king won't leave. She also visited troops at hospitals, factories, and she initially received backlash for wearing rich clothes. So she asked Norman Hartnell to dress her in gentler colors and never black. She became a rainbow of hope to the people. Just like the rest of London was bombed, Buckingham Palace also was bombed and hit several times. Once, when they were there, the king and queen were present. They were having a meeting with Alex Hardinge. She said in response, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look East End in the face." East End was devastated by the bombs. They also lost staff, and they had ration books. They limited the bathwater, and they cut courses on meals. Queen Elizabeth also did revolver training. She practiced seriously. Prime Minister Chamberlain eventually resigns, and Winston Churchill takes over. The king and queen aren't sold on Churchill when he first comes in. And that's because during the debates regarding the constitutional crisis and Edward marrying Wallis Simpson, Winston Churchill supported that current king, Edward VIII. So they were a little iffy on Churchill, but they eventually became very good friends and came to admire each other. During the war, Elizabeth had a personal crisis of her own. And in November of 44, her father died. He had bronchitis and was deaf by that point. He was succeeded in peerage by his son, Patrick. The Earl was buried at Glamis alongside his wife. The war was won on May 8th, 1945. And the royal family and Winston Churchill stood on the balcony at Buckingham Palace and received the people. They actually let their daughters go for the first time within the public to celebrate the victory. It was one of the most meaningful days or nights of their lives because they actually got to pretend to be normal and see what it was like dancing with all the other people that were celebrating the war being won. The Queen also had many engagements and charities she was in charge for. One of them was the Land Army. And when she said goodbye to them, she said, "It's the time to come to say goodbye because the job has been done. But the sadness will be felt at the parting, and it should be outweighed by pride and achievement. Moreover, the Land Army will not in any case be only an affectionate memory. It will live still in the shape of thousands of members who have settled down in the countryside as the wives of farmers and farm workers who are themselves continuing to work in agriculture when the organization itself ends." During the war, Princess Elizabeth fell in love with Prince Philip. She had been enamored with him for many years, but they finally started their relationship during the war. The family was very concerned, and particularly the king and queen, that she's so young. She's 20 years old, and she hasn't met a lot of men yet. And they were also concerned of Philip's German ancestry. And that was partly because he did have German heritage, but his sisters, all of them married Germans. He was a lieutenant in the Navy, and actually from the Greek royal family, even though he was German and Danish. So the king and queen asked Princess Elizabeth to wait until she is 21 to announce any engagement. They go to South Africa in 1947 for 6 months. It was the entire family, the king and queen, and the princesses. And it really seemed like a swan song for we four. They left on the HMS Vanguard, and they're really trying to create a role for the British Empire, which by this point is well in decline. And it's going to eventually become a Commonwealth. The king and queen wanted to endorse Jan Smuts in the upcoming 48 election. They visit South Africa, Southern Rhodesia, and the Bechuanaland Protectorate. They traveled over 10,000 miles total. The king and queen opened the 1947 session of the Union Parliament in Cape Town. Here, Princess Elizabeth turned 21, and she made a promise in a speech to the empire, which was broadcast all around the empire. And there was one time that Queen Elizabeth failed to have impeccable behavior on a tour. Usually she was flawless, but in South Africa, she once broke it. And a royal fan was following the royal car, and she rose her parasol or umbrella and struck the man, thinking he was trying to attack them or an intruder during the procession. And unfortunately, he just had a present for Princess Elizabeth. Princess Elizabeth's engagement was announced in July of 47. The family was still concerned about Philip's ancestry and the public opinion. At first, it was not great by the public's response, but everyone was happy for her. She had her family at her engagement photo shoot. She got a 3-carat center, and it was flanked with 10 additional diamonds, and it was platinum ring. Prince Philip, or the future Prince Philip, had become naturalized and abandoned his Greek royal titles. The wedding took place on November of 1947. It was in Westminster Abbey, and Elizabeth had 8 bridesmaids, including Princess Margaret. She, like her mother, left the bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior. There was a little problem right before the wedding, as the tiara she wanted to use, the Queen Mary French tiara, actually snapped. But the Queen, ever so relaxed, says, "We have 2 hours and plenty of other tiaras." But it was fixed in time. Queen Elizabeth was part of the procession. She was in the carriage that followed Queen Mary and Princess Margaret. Elizabeth came with her father in the Irish state coach, and she got a Welsh gold ring like her mother. They all appeared on the balcony after the wedding. During the honeymoon, Princess Elizabeth told her parents how wonderful her day was and thanked them. The king told her how proud he was of her, and he said, "Your mother was integral in raising you, and it's been marvelous, and you have become wonderful, just as she is the most wonderful woman in the world." The king had been ill since 1947. He even struggled a bit on the South Africa tour. He was diagnosed with arterial sclerosis. He also had Berger's disease. And it was a worry at one time that the leg would need to be amputated. The Queen Elizabeth seemed calm, but she really wasn't internally. She was extremely worried about her husband, and many tours for the king and queen were postponed and given to Princess Elizabeth. In 1951, it was determined that the king had lung changes, and the left lung was removed. It was cancer, but the doctors never actually said to him or the family the word cancer. In 48 and 1950, the king and queen got 2 grandchildren. Prince Charles was born November 14th, 1948, and Princess Anne was born August 15th, 1950. And Queen Elizabeth was overjoyed to have grandchildren, and she watched them while their parents were on royal tours. The Queen was hugely close with Prince Charles, and at times, even later in his life, believed he could do no wrong. She was his biggest supporter in life. On February 6th, 1952, the king died in his sleep. And it was a bit of a shock because he had seemed to be doing okay and at least stable. The funeral was held February 15th, and Elizabeth was now a widow. She was still very young. She stayed at Buckingham Palace for a little bit and eventually moved to Clarence House to be with her daughter, Margaret. She acted fine, but she was internally devastated, and she had wanted to retreat from the spotlight. She originally was going to retire, but Winston Churchill met with her and told her, "Ma'am, your country needs you." And so she decided not to retreat from royal life. She also didn't get along as well with Princess Margaret at the time of her beginning of the widowhood when they were both in Clarence House, partly because she would ask Margaret how events went, and Margaret would go, "Boring." And so that would upset the former queen, who is now known as Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. She actually acquired her own castle, and this was the Castle of May on the north coast of Scotland. It was in disrepair, and she redid it herself. It is now open to the public. Another debacle that happened soon after the king's death was that Princess Margaret had fallen in love with Peter Townsend, her father's equerry. He was divorced and 16 years older than she was. Parliament was against the match because, again, as we remember with Edward VIII, it's hard to marry a divorced person, and even if you're not king, remain in the royal family. So Parliament was really not encouraging this match. On Coronation Day in 1953, to celebrate the Queen's coronation, Princess Margaret was seen flicking a fluff off Peter Townsend's uniform, and people did notice, and so it caught media attention, and everybody was talking about it. The new queen, Elizabeth II, was caught in the middle because she had to consent to Margaret's marriage because she was under a certain age. She was almost 26, but within this matter between new queen and Princess Margaret, the Queen Mother used what we call the ostrich approach. She ignored it and pretended it did not exist. She wanted the two girls to work out their own problems. And so Margaret had 2 years to decide whether she wanted to marry Peter Townsend, because if she married him, she was going to lose her royal privileges. And eventually, she decided against this marriage. The Queen Mother, in 1959, took many trips to Africa. She went to Kenya and Uganda. In 1960, she visited Rhodesia and Nyasaland from the May 11th to May 30th. And she opened the Kariba Dam and hydroelectric scheme, as well as the Central African Trade Fair. And in northern Rhodesia, she toured around and went to Fort Jameson, the oldest town in the area. It was not said in her lifetime, but a controversial statement she made about Africa was that colonization was positive because they could not govern themselves. In 1960, Princess Margaret gets married, and she marries Anthony Armstrong Jones on May 6, 1960. He's a photographer, and the Queen Mum really likes him. They were buried at Westminster Abbey, and Prince Philip walked Margaret down the aisle. Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones dated for 2 years, and for the engagement ring, he gave her ruby marguerite of diamonds on the engagement ring. On May 4th, they had a white tie ball, and this was the first wedding to be broadcast on television. It had 3 million viewers. She had 8 bridesmaids, including Queen Elizabeth II's daughter, Princess Anne, and the bridesmaids' dresses were by Norman Hartnell. She wore the Baltimore tiara, and she had a bouquet of orchids. After the wedding, the next day, they had a wedding breakfast, and they drove away in a Rolls Royce. Queen Elizabeth II had more children. She had Andrew and Edward in the 1960s, and Princess Margaret also had 2 children, David and Sarah. In her later years, the Queen Mother had appendicitis. She broke bones in her foot, and it was not revealed in her lifetime, but she was diagnosed with colon cancer. Her hobbies included fishing, and horse racing. She even is credited for introducing Princess Anne to the steeplechasers. And she also loved the country. She loved ponies, dogs, and gin, in particular, Dubonnet. Whenever things were not going well at the palace, while she was meeting anybody, she would say, "Well, let's have another drink." She visited Iran in 1975, and she was invited by the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And he was interested that she spoke to people of all backgrounds, including ordinary people. She was there for 10 days, and in return, the Shah visited Britain 2 years earlier. While she was in Iran, they ate lunch at a 17th century country palace. He even told her, in her honor, to welcome the British family, he constructed a flush toilet in the building. In 1976 and 84, she took many summer trips to France, including 22 private trips to Europe from 1963 to 1922. She witnessed several of her grandsons and granddaughter get married, and in 81, on July 29th, Charles and Diana got married. And it was exciting for the Queen Mum because she knew Diana's grandmother. They had an okay relationship, but it deteriorated because the Queen Mum refused that Charles could do anything wrong. And Diana also thought that the Queen Mother favored one of her children over the other. And in July of 1986, at Westminster Abbey, Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, and Sarah Ferguson got married. Sophie and Edward got married on the 19th of June, 1999, at St. George's Chapel. They are currently the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. She also met several great-grandchildren through Charles, William and Harry, through Princess Anne, Zara and Peter, through Andrew, Louise and James, and through David Lindley, Charles and Margarita, and through Sarah, Samuel, and Arthur. Margarita, Louise, and James were all born after the Queen Mother's death. Some family secrets came to light. It was found that two of the Queen Mother's nieces, Nerissa and Catherine, were admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Surrey in 1941. Their mother, Fenella, who was the Queen Mother's sister-in-law, gave very vague information on the forms. Poor Nerissa's grave was only marked with a plastic bag and serial number. When asked about the situation, Elizabeth said she did not know anything about the situation at all. For the Queen Mother's 90th birthday, she had a gala on July 19th, 1990, with the London Palladium. She got several performances from entertainers, and she appeared wearing one of her favorite tiaras, the Greyville tiara. She also has pearl drop earrings and Queen Alexandra's wedding necklace, as well as the Duchess of Teck's brooch. Queen Elizabeth II and Margaret joined her at the event. And there was a celebration for 50 years after World War II. The current queen, the Queen Mother, and Margaret all celebrated. And they were on the Buckingham Palace balcony to greet thousands of crowds, and they cheered for the family, but in particular, the Queen Mother, who stepped out first. The Queen Mother kept up with her engagements until 4 months before her death. Her last engagement was the recommissioning of the aircraft Royal Ark in Portsmouth. She had attended its launch in 1981. Princess Margaret had had health problems since 1993. She had pneumonia, a stroke, she scalded her feet in the bathtub and needed help to walk. And then she had another stroke in 2001, and she was partly paralyzed. She never appeared after 2001. In 2002, she went to the hospital in the middle of January. On February 9th, she died at Edward VII Hospital. Her funeral was to take place the 15th of February. It was exactly 50 years from George VI's funeral. There were private services at Glamis and St. Mary Magdalene School. And Margaret was cremated, unlike many members of the royal family. And the Queen Mother at this time was in very poor health, but she was determined to make the funeral. So she got a limousine with blacked out windows and walked in to a secret location that no one would see, private, because she was in a wheelchair at the time. She did not want anyone to see her in the wheelchair. In 2001, while Margaret was struggling, the Queen Mother also was. She fractured her pelvis, but she was determined to stand at the national anthem for her husband on the anniversary of his death, February 6th. Just a week later, the Queen Mother cut her arm at Sandringham. They had to call the ambulance to dress it. And she's really not eating well around Margaret's funeral and afterward. And on the 5th of March, she had a lawn party, and she went to see the Eton Beagles, a charity she had for many years. Then she went back to the Royal Lodge, and that is where she lived out her life. She died on March 30th at the age of 101. She had had a chest cold since Christmas, and she just couldn't beat it. Her daughter, Elizabeth II, and her niece, and also lady-in-waiting, the Honorable Margaret Rhodes, were the two people by her side as she died. She was at Westminster Hall to lie in state, and there were 1,600 troops surrounding. Her 4 grandsons stood by her coffin, and 200,000 mourners passed her coffin as it lay at Westminster Hall. Her death and funeral were called Operation Taybridge, and the funeral took place on the 9th of April, 2002. The Westminster Abbey told 101 times for each year of her life. And her coffin was draped with her personal standard. There was a wreath, the crown, and the gun carriage. There were 1,700 people that were in this procession. There were drummers and pipe bands from all over the Commonwealth. The procession was followed by the family, and this included the Bowes-Lyon family. There were 2,200 guests at the funeral, and it went to Windsor, to St. George's Chapel, to be near her husband. There were also flowers put on the tomb of the unknown warrior. She is buried together with her husband at the George VI Memorial Chapel. Now, their children are there, as well as Prince Philip. She was the first royal to actually make it to 100, although she was surpassed in 2004 by Alice, the Duchess of Gloucester. She was a sign of stability and strength, and she was so popular. She was humorous, optimistic, she had great manners, and she was funny, especially with her love of the drink. The Archbishop of Canterbury almost took it one time by mistake, and she grabbed it out of his hands and said, "No, wait, that's mine." And the RMS Elizabeth was named after her. 2/3 of her money went to her great-grandchildren, and the rest to the Queen. Her will was sealed, and this aggravated many people. They wanted to see the will. They thought that if it was sealed, then something fishy might be going on, but it's never been seen. And she's really quite a remarkable woman. She lived through several different reigns, and she saw the Victorian period go into the modern age. And she's just really quite a fascinating individual. So thank you for coming.